Hello, everybody. It's 12 o'clock, and that means it's time to get started with our Wildfire Wednesdays webinar. Welcome to today's Wildfire Wednesdays webinar, which is called The Land of Fire. My name is Dan Stark, FNR Extension Agent for Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties, and your host today. Today's webinar is part of a webinar series meant to help prepare Oregonians for wildfire season as part of our Fire Aware, Fire Prepared program. Today, this webinar explores some fire basics, from principles of fire ecology to fire histories and fire regimes across the state. Overall, the Wildfire Wednesdays webinar series aims to address preparedness at 3 levels: individual, community, and the landscape. Today, we begin the second half of these webinars with new Wildfire Wednesday sessions about fire on the landscape, fire ecology, and fire behavior, what to expect when a fire hits, and our last session will cover recovery after a fire. Throughout the second half of this series, we have local online meetings that will dial this information in for your area and county. And because you signed up for this webinar, you'll receive information for those area-specific meetings, so stay tuned and feel free to visit the online webinar guide for updates. I have some logistics to go over before we get started with our webinar today. Before we begin our presentations, I just want to talk to you about some of these logistical things. So this session is being recorded, and this and all past webinar recordings can be found on our FNR YouTube channel, and also a link that we'll be providing for you in a minute here in our chat box. We are also streaming. I don't know if we're streaming live on Facebook today here, so I need to pass that part on that. So there is closed captioning feature, so hopefully you are all seeing that at the bottom of your screens. If you do not want to see the captioning, simply go live to the live transcript and hide the subtitles. For the people tuning into the webinar on Zoom, your audio has been muted. If you're having audio troubles and are connected to your computer's audio, I suggest hanging up and dialing in with your phone. If you're having technical difficulties, you can always ask for assistance in the chat window. If you have questions about any of the information that is being presented, please type your question into the Q&A window. We have limited time, but we'll do our very best to answer your questions live, but we also have panelists on board who may give you a written response in the Q&A window. If you don't catch all the information presented, don't worry. We will provide all the resources and links mentioned during the webinar on our fire program website. We will follow up with an email just to be sure you get the information you need. Okay, I want to first introduce Kara Bylog as our moderator today. She is a program coordinator for Oregon State University Extension out of Jackson County. And I also want to introduce Carrie Berger, our co-host today, who's our fire program manager. We are pleased to have 3 presenters from the fire program here with us today. First up, we will hear from Ariel Cowan, Central Region Fire Specialist based in Deschutes County, who's going to provide some basic fire information, followed by Amanda Rao, our Regional Fire Specialist based in Lane County and serving the Willamette Valley and Cascade Fire Service areas, to hear about fire history, fire regimes, and fire effects. And our third speaker is Christopher Adlam, Regional Fire Specialist serving the Southwest Fire Service area and based in the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center in Central Oregon, who will present on fire exclusion, indigenous use of fire, and some of the changed conditions under which fires are burning today. Before I hand it over to Ari, I would like to help set the stage for today's webinar with a quote from Klamath River Jack in a letter that he wrote to the U.S. Forest Service in 1916, explaining the importance of cultural burning to healthy ecosystems. He says in this letter, "Indian burn every year just same, so keep all ground clean. No bark, no dead leaf, no old wood on ground, no old wood on brush, so no bug could stay to eat leaf, and no worm can stay to eat berry and acorn. Not much on ground to make hot fire, so never hurt big trees where fire burn." With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ari. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to switch over to my slides here. All right, great. Hopefully all of you can see that. So yeah, thank you, Dan. That was a powerful quote from Klamath River Jack that really highlights Indigenous people's awareness of the way fire interacted with the land and their food sources. There is much we can learn from that awareness, and a general knowledge of fire ecology can guide our efforts to be good stewards of the land. As Dan said, my name is Ariel Cowan, and this is our opportunity to introduce to you a topic I'm personally fascinated by and enjoy talking about. The beautiful state of Oregon was shaped by fire, from the forests to the grasslands and sage steppe. I've discovered that learning Oregon fire ecology changes the way that you look at your surroundings. So what is fire ecology? It's pretty much summed up as fire's relationship to both the living and the non-living environment. And to get a good understanding of fire ecology around our state, I'll get you started with the basics and go over some key terms you'll likely hear in the rest of the webinar. Next, Amanda will guide you through fire history and fire's importance to different ecosystems across the state. Then Chris will talk about Indigenous use and other uses of fire and the impacts of fire exclusion on ecosystems. At the end, Chris will go over a bit of what we might expect for the future of Oregon's fire environment. Understanding fire ecology should start with an understanding of what fire is. This is the classic fire triangle that identifies how all three elements, heat, oxygen, and fuel, are required for fire to exist. These elements come together in a chemical reaction to produce flames. This plays into the other triangle from fire science, the fire behavior triangle. As you can see, fuel is an important element to both fire and fire behavior. Fire behavior depends on many factors, but can mostly be boiled down to weather, topography, and fuel. For topography, fire accelerates when moving uphill because of the preheating of the fuels ahead of the flames. So steeper terrain can contribute to increased fire behavior. Also, canyons and ravines can channel hot air, which can also preheat fuels and accelerate fire spread. Aspect, or the facing direction of a hillside, can influence the type of vegetation or fuel that exists there and how dry or warm the conditions are. Weather influences fire starts through lightning, can influence fire spread from blowing winds, but also temperatures and precipitation influence fire behavior through their impacts on fuel moisture and heat. The last but important element is fuel. Fuel is any flammable material, like vegetation or other forms of organic matter, but can also include man-made materials. Types of fuel, their size, shape, their flammable oil content, how they are spatially arranged, and their moisture content all contribute to fire behavior. Fire ecology can influence fire behavior. For example, some species of shrubs grow even better after fire, but can also create highly flammable fuel and influence fire behavior when burned again. Since fire ecology is intertwined with fuels, it's good to recognize the types of fuels. Here's a great table on fuels classified by size and how they respond to their environment. Grass and pine needles are examples of what we call fine fuels or 1 hour fuels. The hour notation really just refers to how quickly they respond to atmospheric moisture. So grasses and tree needles are first to dry out compared to larger fuels like logs and stumps. The fine to medium fuels are usually what carry and spread fire. And for all of you who know how to build a good campfire, you'll know that you can't just start with logs. You need to gather and light kindling in order to get your campfire going. So the same holds true for wildfires. They need the small fuels to act as kindling. So as you can imagine, some types of plants and trees are great contributors to fire behavior, depending on the kindling they provide and how quickly they dry out. So we talked about fuel size classes. Let's talk about spatial arrangement of fuels. When there are continuous, close together fuels, they can easily spread fire to each other. Examples include dry grasses, lots of sagebrush or other shrubs all next to each other, or a dense stand of trees. Some forest types contain lots of natural ladder fuels, which is a spatial arrangement of fuels that allows fire to spread from the ground up into the canopies of trees. Examples of ladder fuels would be shrubs or tall grass growing beneath trees, or really low-hanging branches. Once fire is in the canopies of trees, embers can easily be picked up by winds and spread fire long distances. The spatial arrangement and types of fuel lead into our main wildland fire types. Ground fire, creep or smolder through the litter and duff on the ground. Surface fires are fires that spread along the vegetation on the ground, like in the forest understory, grass fires, or in rangeland fires. Crown fires occur when fires spread through the canopies of trees, which could have started on the ground and reached the canopy through ladder fuels or through embers landing in the canopy. So how does fire affect the living and non-living environment? Well, the intensity of fire influences the severity of the effects. Fire intensity is essentially the heat energy released from combustion. If you remember from our fire behavior triangle, fuels, weather, and topography contribute to fire behavior, and the magnitude of that behavior can be described by flame lengths and height, or in the case of soil burning, can be the temperature and the duration of soil heating. The wildland fire types I went over before generally match with these fire intensity levels. So ground, surface, and crown. So the severity of the impact on living things and soil is a product of the fire's intensity. The fire severity can have different meanings. Severity can be about the impact on trees measured by tree mortality, or another example is it can be about the impact on soils. Usually, fire severity refers to tree impacts. Severity maps, like this one used from the 2020 White River Fire in Wasco County, use light reflectance captured by satellite imagery from before and after the fire to measure the loss of canopy cover. Other maps use the loss of tree diameter area or some other index. However, some of the ecosystems across our state do not have trees but still burn. So the big takeaway I want you to get from this slide is that high intensity fire can create a high severity impact, but that's not always true. Soil burn severity is a different measure of severity that shows that tree scorching, tree death, or loss of canopy does not always equate to the same level of impact on the ground. In the case of the White River Fire, which at times was very wind-driven, the fire burned through the canopy fast enough without high levels of soil burning. So if you see here, there's some more of that example of higher levels of loss of percent canopy cover. And then the bottom map is a soil burn severity map and shows how some of the areas with the most loss of tree canopy actually burned at low severity on the ground. Why is this important for fire ecology? Well, soil conditions are key for recovery because it's what most of the plant life grows out of that supports other life and is also habitat for important microbes, insects, and small burrowing mammals. So patches of low, moderate, or unburned soil can also be a refuge for life. Recovery of life is a big part of fire ecology, and some life forms recover faster or stronger than others. You may have heard the term fire resilience, or the ability to recover to pre-fire conditions. On this diagram, thing 1 is a fire resilient creature, and thing 2 is a fire sensitive creature. For example, let's say a ponderosa pine is thing 1 and a fir tree is thing 2. Fire can disturb both the pine and the fir tree, but the pine tree can bounce back. In some cases, a fire-adapted thing 1 can grow even stronger than before because it has less competition for food or water, more growing space, or some other way the fire provided for it. Thing 2 might have been stressed enough from the impacts of the fire that it died as a direct result, or something else like disease or a drought finished it. But let's not leave out thing 3. Some fire adapted life forms are dependent on fire or are triggered by the impacts on its surroundings. They might be at low levels of health or presence before a fire and resurge as a result of the habitat benefits. For example, some plant species have dormant seeds in the soil and sprout after fire. This concept also applies to some animal species. Fire's ability to remove or set back dominant living things is really part of a larger cycle called succession that's important for ecosystem health. There are different stages of ecological succession. Fire is a type of disturbance, and many of the systems in Oregon rely on disturbance to restart the cycle of succession. In some cases, the intensity of disturbance that an ecosystem is already adapted to can help to increase species diversity by providing an area for a level playing field for what we could call the underdogs, who normally would battle the few dominant species. If you like rooting for the underdog, you might like the species that thrive after fire. So to learn more about fire history and what living things like fire around our state, I'll now turn it over to Amanda Rao, Regional Fire Specialist for the Willamette Valley and North Cascades.
Thank you, Ari. I'll just take a moment here to get my screen up and running. Okay, ready to go. Well, Ari just provided an excellent introduction there and also foundational principles for my piece, which is really looking around the state at the fire regime's ecology and history in Oregon. But before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about what a fire regime is. Ari did a great job of connecting the flame and the fire event in this graph through the commonality of fuel. But a fire regime is something that occurs at the scale of the landscape or the region. And it's generally looking at years, decades, or even centuries in time. When we look specifically at Oregon, we see that we have all 5 fire regime groups represented. I'm going to walk through those here quickly. Fire regime 1 is every 3 to 5 year, it's a 0 to 35 year return interval. And it's really intended to be of low severity and very common. When we look at fire regime 2, it's of the same interval, every 0 to 35 years, but the effect is one of replacement. So instead of maintaining some of what's there and being of low severity, it's really intended to replace what's there and start everything over. When we move into fire regime group 3, we have 35 to 200 year return intervals with mixed to low severity. And then in group 4, the same return interval of 35 to 200 years, but the effect is of a stand replacement effect, so higher severity. And then in group 5, it is of greater than 200 years return interval, and it can be mixed, low, or replacement. So what influences a fire regime? Well, we know that that similar impacts to the fire triangle exist, but they're represented slightly differently. Here, fuels is vegetation. We also have topography instead of weather, we have climate, but then we add humans because many fire regimes result from what we call anthropogenic disturbance. So now I'm going to jump into our tour around the state. We're going to start in the southeast corner. You'll see here that the majority of this area is represented by fire regime group 3. So that's the 0 to 35 year or 35 to 200 year return interval at mixed to low severity. Looking historically at photos of the area, we know that, and this is, by the way, this is of Prineville, but this is really representative of further south and east in Oregon. In the early 1900s, when grazing as a form of disturbance was impacting the landscape, colonial settlement was occurring, and some of those first visual representations, I'm getting a message that my screen has stopped sharing for some reason. Hold on.
No, it looks good. I can.
Okay, sorry, I'll keep going then. It says my screen sharing is paused, but I'm gonna ignore that.
Yeah, you're on the what influences a fire regime slide.
Okay, thanks. So I'm sorry, what slide are you saying I'm on?
What influences a fire regime?
Okay, so it's not showing photos of Prineville right now?
Nope.
Okay. Now what are you seeing?
Great, looks great.
Okay. So folks, apologies for that technical difficulty. So we're going to go ahead and pick it up here in the Southeast. I'm not sure that you guys saw some of my other slides, but I don't want to put the other presenters behind. So in the Southeast part of the state, we see that, that pictures from the 1900s show a very open landscape devoid of a lot of trees. And then, you know, within a century, they've been largely encroached upon by Western juniper, which is a native species. The impacts of that encroachment can be shown here in this map, and how those affect areas such as priorities for sage-grouse conservation is also represented here. That's significant because sage-grouse do not really utilize juniper, but they do utilize areas that are free of juniper that include mountain sage and perennial grasslands. So in 1936, the extent of Western juniper was fairly limited, but we see that by the time we reach modern era, that it has expanded significantly, and it has expanded into sage-grouse habitat. So that is essentially a fire exclusion problem, and that has resulted in a habitat loss for this species. But we also have issues with too much fire, and that is from a fire cycle involving invasive annual grasses, which respond favorably to wildfire and then colonize and perpetuate themselves. And so it's important to recognize that while a lot of places in Oregon are lacking fire, some actually need more than, or some are experiencing more than what they would have historically experienced. We also want to note that in Southeast Oregon, lodgepole pine is present, and it's also present in Central Oregon. And I think it's worth noting that there's a lot of overlap. This tour is more like a Venn diagram in terms of the overlap between different areas. Central Oregon, for example, could be addressed on its own, but it's really covered between both Southeast and Northeast Oregon. But the question of whether lodgepole pine is fire dependent or fire adapted is a good one, right? Because we usually hear that its cones are serotinous and it needs fire. Well, in Oregon, that's not necessarily the case. It does respond favorably to fire, but it doesn't necessarily need fire in order for it to reproduce. So its cones are non-serotinous, and it's typically an early colonizer post-fire that then develops into other forest types over time. Now we're going to move into Northeast Oregon. And again, as I said, that includes Central Oregon. And when we look here at the fire regime groups, we see quite a spread. We see a mix of that infrequent stand replacement, but we also see a fair amount of that frequent low severity fire, the kind of fire that would produce a stand like this, which is an historic photo of old ponderosa pine stand that would have had frequent fire, maybe even as often as every 5 to 10 years. What we know is that these systems are on a fairly regular pattern. They need to have fire enter them with enough regularity that they maintain what you see in year 0 here and year 80 on the bottom. But when you remove that frequent fire element, the stand becomes unhealthy because it cannot actually support all of the growth that's occurring. So fire really is kind of like in a garden, that natural thinning agent that comes in and reduces the competition and leaves the nutrients for what is left. But when we have too little fire, we end up with too many trees. And often in the northeast part of the state, that will involve the encroachment of grand fir, as well as sapling, ponderosa pine, and other species into these large stands of large diameter ponderosa pine that evolved at that frequent fire that would have controlled their historic densities. So looking at the large fire history here in Deschutes County, we see that there's really quite a deficit on the landscape overall, especially when you consider that kind of frequency in these systems. If they were supposed to burn, every 10 years or so, then this whole map should be colored in one color or another, but there is no history for a lot of this area for quite some time. It's also important to note that in the northeast part of the state, as well as the southeast part of the state, there are problems with cheatgrass and again, other invasive annual grasses where we see an increase in fire frequency. And this is just kind of a spatial representation of that. Fire perimeters that are overlapping. This would be an area that in this case is seeing fire about every 6 years. But the historic condition here would be fire every maybe 35 to 45 years. So this is, again, too much fire on the landscape. And now we're going to move into Southwest Oregon. I'm going to play a video for you guys while I read a couple of quotes from early explorers and colonial settlers in the area. Of the hundreds of persons who visit the Pacific Slope in California every summer to see the mountains, few see more than the immediate foreground and a haze of smoke which even the strongest glass is unable to penetrate. That's Seahart Merriam in 1898. And from General Joseph Lane regarding Table Rocks in the 1850s, the hilltops now covered by dense thickets of manzanita, madrone, or evergreen brush were then devoid of brush and trees because of the Indian habit of burning over the surface to remove obstructions to their seed and acorn gathering. So here you see in the southwestern part of the state, the majority of it is represented by that low severity frequent fire regime. At the low elevation, we see primarily oak woodlands and grasslands. Frequency is every 3 to 5 years, and the severity is typically low. Most of the species that benefit, aside from the understory herbaceous layer, are Oregon white oak, black oak, and madrone, all of which have adaptations to fire. When you move up in elevation, which is a common ecotonal influence on how fire behaves and the effects that it has, then we see the frequency increase to every 8 to 13 years, and the severity goes up a little bit. It's still mostly low, but it can become kind of moderate, and the species start to shift towards ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, with some of the other previously mentioned species included. In mixed evergreen forests, we end up at a higher elevation. Historic fire frequency is less frequent, and the severity becomes more moderate to high. Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and then a whole suite of other species are included in those higher elevations. Looking at species and how they respond specifically to fire, we know that in recently burned areas within 2 or 3 years burned, that hairy woodpeckers, Townsend's solitaire, dark-eyed juncos are all found. And then places that are burned often, so not just recently burned, but repeatedly burned, in those areas you can find lazuli buntings, rufous hummingbirds, spotted towhees, fox sparrows, white-crowned sparrows, and the Nashville warbler. Old burned areas attract different kinds of bird species, and in this particular area, wren tits, orange-crowned warblers, black-headed grosbeaks, and McGilvery's warbler. Now we're going to shift to the northwest part of the state, and this includes almost all of the fire regimes except for 2 and 4. So I guess it really just includes 3 of them. But more research that's being conducted in fire history is revealing a lot more complexity in the fire return intervals, as frequent in some areas as every 5 years or so. And so I think we'll see these maps change over time as we learn more. Next, I'm going to play a video. It's going to show you a prescribed burn, a modern prescribed burn with some audio from David G. Lewis, who's a professor at Oregon State University and works in ethnic studies and archaeology, and has a lot to say about the interactions between Indigenous people and tribal communities and fire on the landscape.
but fire was used as a tool for the trees.
So Amanda, we are not hearing the narration from our side. We're just seeing the video. Do we want to try that again, and so we can pick up the narration on that?
Oh, okay. Well, I think that I'll go ahead and explain it here in the interest of time. Thank you for notifying me about that. I was hoping that would come
Thank you,
through guys. What David was talking about there was that it was fairly well understood, and still is today, by the people who are represented by the Kalapuyan language group, which on this map is in the yellow, that they understood that the kind of fire that we experienced over Labor Day happens, and they started using fire as a means of not only abating that threat, but cultivating cultural resources and a really nice place to live, frankly. The Willamette Valley has the benefit of a good climate for things to grow, and photosynthesis does really well here. And so it requires some maintenance, and fire was the tool and still is the tool of the Kalapuyan. And it varies from use of fire to heat and cook, boil and clean, burning patches for berries and root harvest, as well as maintaining trails and creating supple materials for weaving, and then broadcast burning for creating wildlife habitat, driving game, and hunting. But overall, I think initially the idea was that creating a more inhabitable landscape was most easily achieved with fire as a primary tool. And so in the Willamette Valley, the fire return intervals vary quite a bit. And so I included this map here because it ranges from 6 to 1,000 years, depending where you are. And 6 might actually not be as tight of an interval as it really should be. It probably is closer to 3 years in a lot of areas. And that corresponds directly to vegetation. So in the upland prairie and wet prairie, you would have seen fire return interval on a frequent basis. And then as you move up in elevation, as I described before, you see less and less fire. And so in oak woodlands, the return interval is not as frequent. And then by the time you get into, say, gallery forests and floodplains, you won't see fire any more frequently than, say, every 1,000 years. There are many species that rely upon fire. I won't go through all of these individually, but many of them are listed. And the diversity basically concentrates where there's the most fire. So the valley bottom is where you would see the most fire historically, and that's where the plant diversity exists. As you move up in elevation, it drops off a little bit, but it's still diverse nonetheless and very dependent on fire. Oak woodlands typically, again, don't see fire quite as frequently because the canopy closure retains more moisture and doesn't allow fire to spread as readily as in open areas. And then looking more up into the mountains on either side, the Willamette National Forest towards the east, and then the Coast Range on the west side. Our fire history in the Coast Range is extrapolated from a variety of methods of historical records and some reconstructions. And we know there was a lot of fire in the Coast Range from the late 18th through the early 20th centuries. And that's really in that more standard placement fire regime that we're talking about. So we know the Coast Range is going to be due for some events, in the not too distant future, and maybe sooner given the impacts of climate change. And then on the Willamette, you'll see that there's a fair amount of fire history, but boy, did 2020 really put some marks on that map. And we'll see what 2020 through 2029 looks like in the future. But still a lot of fire history all the way back to the 50s in what is generally considered a fairly infrequent regime. And then to just kind of try to show an explanation for this visually, you know, this dynamic basically starts with at zero with some kind of disturbance, generally a fire. And the forest can develop in the absence of disturbance to get to the point that it's ready to burn again. But there's actually a lot of fire in the time frame from year 0 through year 300 or 400. And that breaks up the forest structure and creates a lot of heterogeneity and benefits to wildlife. And then we also know that Douglas fir on the west side has really established itself episodically during periods of widespread fire. And so we know that it hasn't always been on the landscape in Northwest Oregon to the extent that we see it today. And I think that's important to understand because the loss of a lot of the Doug fir in the recent fires, while that has been pretty difficult to witness and you know be a part of, from a historical context, that's a fairly normal thing. And we'll probably see some Doug fir establishment as a result of these fires, or potentially other species that you know want to establish themselves in those areas. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Adlam.
Thank you, Amanda. So you should be seeing my slides, and please let me know if you're not.
Looks good, Chris.
So thank you, Amanda and Ari. We've had a great whirlwind overview of fire ecology across the state and the natural role of fire. And what you've probably heard from Amanda also is that the natural role of fire has been altered during the 20th century. And this is largely because of a policy of putting out all fires that originated in the early 1900s. Now, at the time, there was a lively debate as to whether this was a good idea or not. But because of a large fire that occurred in 1910, this policy that we would put out all fires is the one that prevailed. And you can see this attitude in the comments by early US Forest Service Chief Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, who said in 1905, "Today we understand that forest fires are wholly within the control of men." His successor, Henry Graves, said, "Fire prevention is the fundamental obligation of the Forest Service and takes precedence over all other duties and activities." At the time, this is what our dry forests would have looked like. Dry forests such as ponderosa pine stands in Southwest Oregon or in the east of the Cascades. And with frequent fire, you had these large, open-spaced, fire-resistant trees with very little undergrowth. Early settlers commented about the ease of riding through these forests on horseback and pulling carriages. Without fire by 1948, dense regeneration was coming up under these trees. And by 1989, you couldn't ride a horse, let alone a carriage, through these forests because of what fire ecologist Paul Hesburgh calls an epidemic of trees. So this fire suppression policy, we could say, has been successful. Historically, there was a lot more fire on the landscape in the Pacific Northwest. In Oregon and Washington, the forested lands that were burning every year were about 1.6 million acres, and that's excluding grassland, sagebrush, and other shrublands. So 1.6 million acres of forest land burning every year. That's that gray box. In comparison today, that red box, that's the fire extent we have today on average. That's less than 1/10. As Amanda has pointed out, because of the change, the suppression of fire, these large fire-dependent, fire-resistant trees that we used to grow far apart are now surrounded by small, dense regrowth. And what is the consequence of this? The other change that we are seeing is that when fire does inevitably burn in these landscapes, it burns a lot hotter and kills more trees. So historically, about 6 to 9% of dry forests would have burnt at high severity, killing all the trees. Now we have more than 1/3, 36% of trees, of area burnt is burning at high severity. And so the more we've put out fires, the more fires have become, the more intense they've become, and the harder they are to suppress. This is called the Wildfire Paradox. And it was defined in this paper in 2014 like this: wildfire suppression, effective 95 to 98% of the time, inevitably leads to ecologically significant wildfires with higher intensities and rapid growth that are unable to be suppressed. So the more we've put out fires in these dry forests, the more the fuel has built up, such that when fire inevitably comes in the late season, when it's hot and dry and windy, there is very little we can do to stop them. Like I said, this is true particularly for dry forests. And as Amanda mentioned, our fire regimes are diverse across the state. So dry forests are not as common in, for example, Northwestern Oregon, where you have more of this type of forest that we would call climate limited. They have a fire regime that's climate limited. That means that in a typical year, it is too wet and cool for forests in, for example, the North Coast Range and the Western Cascades to burn. So these forests develop high levels of biomass, lots of trees, very thick, and fire suppression has not had as much of an impact in these forests because it was not uncommon for these forests to go a long time between fires. But today we also have an added challenge, which is climate change. If climate is what limited fire activity in these forests historically, and that climate is getting warmer and drier, we can expect to see more fire in these forests, more area burnt, more large fires, and an increase in fire frequency. Now, it's important to remember that area burn annually and fire frequency in most places is still far below the historic levels. But because of climate change in certain areas, and particularly our wetter forests, we are likely to see changes in the near future. These changes will also catalyze shifts in forest composition. We know that the future climate is going to be more suitable to mixed forests, forests with a higher proportion of deciduous trees like oaks, maples, and madrones that are going to take over in places which were previously dominated by conifers. So we know that the area burnt is going to increase. Many studies have shown this, and this is across all our ecoregions. We know that this is going to happen despite our best efforts to put them out. What we can do, though, is through forest restoration and prescribed burning, increase the resilience of these forests so that when fires do come, they will be less intense, and they will leave more trees, and the ecosystems will be better able to respond and recover. Like I said, and like Amanda pointed out, while this is a huge concern, the fire paradox, climate change, increasing fire activity, increasing fire severity, we also must remember that many parts of our landscape are missing fire, and they are not healthy as a result. We see forest stands with increasing levels of disease and beetle mortality, forest stands that are not able to change and respond to climate change, they're more vulnerable. And we see a number of plants and other organisms that are declining because of the lack of fire. If we take a small sampling of these endangered species, plant species in Oregon, as Amanda mentioned, if you look at the threats listed, fire suppression, the lack of fire, is consistently one of the threats to these species. For example, we see threats including changes in fire frequency and seasonality, successional encroachment by trees and shrubs from fire suppression and associated activities, change in community structure due to plant succession and the absence of disturbance such as fire. So how do we escape this wildfire paradox? We know we need to live with fire, and attitudes have been changing since the early 1900s. This is a quote from the head of the Forest Service today, Vicki Christensen, who says this, and you will see quite a contrast from the quotes from earlier. We must take the long view, accepting the inevitability of fire visiting our landscapes and preparing ourselves so that when fire does come calling, the consequences are not devastating. Whenever possible, we need to reintroduce fire under conditions we choose. Fire is the primary change agent on many of our federal lands and has been for millennia. We started this webinar with a quote from Klamath River Jack, a Hoopa fire practitioner, and he was writing in 1916. So now with this context, you can see that 1916 is in the early days of the fire suppression policy. And already Klamath River Jack was seeing changes in the landscape that were of great concern to him, which is what prompted him to write to the Forest Service to explain the negative impacts that he was seeing on the land from the lack of fire. He ends his letter in this way. Now white man never burn. He passed law to stop all fire in forest and wild pasture. White man say he don't understand why wild berry get small and more few every year, and acorn get all wormy and no more grassland, and why deer die when they eat sour grass under brush and tree made sour by too much shade. Indian know, and by white man say he know too, but Indians say, white man, you know too late. So after more than 100 years, are we learning the lessons of living in a land of fire? I hope that through today's webinar, you've been able to get a glimpse of how important fire is to the health of many of our ecosystems and how fire's activity on the landscape is changing. And also hopefully a small glimpse at the importance of fire for Indigenous communities who've used it in sophisticated ways for thousands of years. My hope is that through learning about how resilient our landscapes are to fire, we can also move towards adapting to living in a land of fire. So I thank you for your attention. And in closing, I want to bring up a couple of tools that you can use to explore fire ecology in your area. These are two websites and they will be listed in the resources. One is the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer, and the other is a federal website called MTBS, Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity. And through these tools, you can research fire activity in your area, including the severity of how fire has burnt and specific fires. And if you are able, and if access permits, I encourage you to go and see for yourself what an area looks like that has burnt. What species do you see there? Which ones seem to be doing better, maybe are more common since the fire? What signs of the fire do you see? How can you imagine the fire behaved and moved through this landscape? What sort of adaptations are you noticing in the species that are present?
Okay, thank you, Chris. And with that, I'm going to ask all of our presenters to come online today, and we're going to start our Q&A section, and I'm going to hand it over to our moderator today, Kara Baylog. Thank you, Kara.
Thanks, Dan. So the first question we have up already, folks are talking about, well, how do I get fire on my land? I was wondering if you guys could pick up on what are, so forest landowner, a private forest landowner wants to put fire in their land, who needs to get involved?
That's an excellent question. And I think it depends a lot in the part of the, what part of the state you are in. Right now, prescribed fire is kind of a challenge for private landowners to be able to use it. We are at the fire program, and other groups like the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council are working towards making prescribed fire more available to private landowners. But that's going to be kind of a situation that's going to depend. Some people, for example, get help from land management agencies such as BLM or the US Forest Service if you have acreage next to public lands. Other people in other parts of the state, like in southwestern Oregon, you have landowners coming together to share equipment and resources to be able to do prescribed burns in a cooperative way using what's called prescribed burn associations. And in other places like the Willamette Valley, you have agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service that will sometimes do prescribed burns on highly ecologically important lands. And the other option, of course, is if you can hire a contractor to do that. That we have very highly skilled contractors who can do prescribed burns.
Great, thanks, Chris. Sorry. So the next question I have is, is there any data or hypotheses about what fire regimes were like before even Indigenous people were in the area?
I can take that one too, if you like. That's an interesting question. You know, the important thing to point out is that before Indigenous people were in the area, the vegetation was different. You know, so Indigenous people have been in the area since before the ecosystems that exist now were here. So, you know, if Indigenous people have been in an area, say, for example, for 12 or 20,000 years, depending on how that's defined, or the ecosystem would have been completely different then. And so the ecosystems that we see today on the landscape have evolved with Indigenous burning. And so there was never a time when we saw the current ecosystems assembled without Indigenous people being present.
Yeah, and I'd also like to say that there's a lot of fascinating new research coming out using dendrochronology, which is basically looking at tree ring analysis and fire scars, you know, kind of using trees as a source of looking at the fire history in different parts of the west side of the Cascades. And it's been pretty fascinating to hear that there's a lot more evidence for more fire in certain locations, and then a very distinct disruption of an end of all of those fires, and that linking up with a time of disease and movement of Indigenous peoples. But I think a lot of that research is still coming out. So yeah, we're definitely going to be keeping our eyes and ears out to what new research is coming out.
Great, thanks,
Great
Ari
question.
and Chris. Our next question is the role of lightning, because of course we know some areas do have lightning started fires more often than others. In the Willamette Valley, so this is probably going to Amanda, do we see lightning play a role, or was it really just human?
Yes, we do see lightning start fires in the Willamette Valley. In fact, just a few years ago, a lightning strike hit a butte called Ward Butte outside of Brownsville, and actually burned down the butte because it was so inaccessible. So there are occasions when lightning starts fires in the Willamette Valley. The key to understanding the fire regime here is in that the amount of lightning is not sufficient enough to account for the frequency of fire here. And so the idea is that most likely the Kalapuyan learned from watching lightning strikes or watching fires burn down from the high Cascades into the valley, and that fire was really their teacher, and that then they took up fire as their teacher and made friends with it and learned to use it for a ton of different reasons beyond that. So certainly it's likely that the first ignitions that really changed things in the Willamette Valley at a small scale were from lightning, but that the Kalapuyan people picked that up and then expanded it out and grew it out from there. So I would call the lightning ignitions here maybe a seed for that anthropogenic fire regime. But again, it's not sufficient enough to account for the amount of fire on the landscape here. And that actually applies to the areas that Ari is talking about as well. The research that's going on in the high Cascades shows that the frequency is not accounted for by the accompanied lightning that occurs. And so there's really just not enough lightning on the landscape to actually create the kind of fire effects and fire history that we're seeing. And that, as I said, is in the Willamette Valley going all the way up into the hills.
Great. I think we only have time for one more question in order to keep everything on time. So I'm going to go with this next question. What role does native understory vegetation play in fuels, and how can we continue to encourage diverse and complex forest structure for a habitat that will still be fire resilient? Don't everybody talk at once.
I was wanting to give the opportunity for others to chime in first, but maybe someone will follow up after I speak about it. So, you know, that really depends on what part of the state you're in, but at least I can speak for Central Oregon to South Central Oregon area that I serve, that there's a lot of native shrubs that and other plants that live in the understory that do contribute as a natural fuel. I mean, some of them are just naturally have highly flammable oils in their leaves and the woody part of the plant. And so they can burn at higher intensities. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we should discourage native plants. They're out there, and if anything, we can encourage their growth, but at the same time be more strategic about, you know, if we're wanting to protect certain places that we want there to not be as extreme fire, uncharacteristic, unnaturally extreme fire behavior in those forests, that we can go in and do some restoration treatments in order to reduce some of that fuel loading. So those native plants can still be there, but we can actually, if they've become dominant, if for example, some of those shrubs have become dominant, then the restoration of maybe removing some of them can maybe open up some of that playing field for some of the native forbs, native flowering plants to come in, as long as we keep an eye on invasive plants and making sure that we consider them. Maybe someone else has something to say about this topic.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for Q&A. So thanks so much. I'm going to turn it over back to Dan.
Thank you. And so, yeah, thank you to our presenters today that made this webinar happen, and to all of you for joining us. We recognize we are still recovering from a really hard wildfire season last year, and we appreciate you turning into these webinars to get yourselves, your families, and your communities prepared for the next wildfire season. For those of you who didn't get your questions answered, we'll provide answers to the questions we didn't get to live in a follow-up email. Carrie just mentioned that she's also going to be sending around these resources in a follow-up email to everybody who's registered today. So we're taking good care of you. Chris mentioned a little bit about a call to action today. So I did part of what we do in our webinar series, if we give you some homework to do. So this week's call to action, if you're just starting out, go on a nature hike and look for the characteristics of wildfire or lack of wildfire on the landscape. If you live in the West, like I do, in the Northwest, consider the landscape around your community and wildland areas. When do you think fire has last been on the land? How can you tell? How do you think the species around you would respond to fire? If you're further along and already have an understanding of wildland fire ecology, learn more about the relationships between Indigenous peoples and tribal communities in your area, and talk with a friend or neighbor about the interactions between people and nature through fire. Thank you. And don't forget to join us on June 2nd, same day and time, for our next Wildfire Wednesdays webinar, When Fire Hits, with Daniel Leavell, statewide fire specialist at the OSU Extension Fire Program, and Kelly Burns, appropriate last name, chief for the Ashland Fire and Rescue. I'm sure she gets a lot of comments about that. A reminder that this webinar has been recorded, and feel free to share out. We will send a follow-up email, like I mentioned, with all the resources, including any questions that weren't answered live. Stay safe, everybody, and see you at the next Wildfire Wednesdays, Fire Aware, Fire Prepared. Thank you so much.